Ainslie Park High School stood in the East Pilton area of Edinburgh. In 1971, the head of the school's Department of Outdoor Education was 23-year-old Ben Beattie, originally from Belfast. An experienced climber, Beattie led a group of 14 students on an expedition to the Cairngorms in the Scottish Highlands in November of that year. Beattie's girlfriend, 21-year-old Cathy Davidson, joined them, acting as another guide.
The Ainslie Park group arrived at the Outdoor Education Centre at Lagan on Friday, November 19th, and spent the first night of their trip there. On the Saturday morning, the group was joined by Sheila Sunderland, an 18-year-old volunteer guide. All 17 took a chairlift to the Ptarmigan restaurant, situated at 3,500 feet. After lunch, 2 parties were formed. Beattie set off with the most experienced children, 6 boys and 2 girls. Davidson and Sunderland would take the rest of the children. Among them was Carol Bertram, celebrating her 16th birthday that day. Her twin brother had hoped to also be there, but was too late in returning his consent form. Both groups had the same aim that Saturday, to ascend Cairngorm and cross the high plateau to Ben Macdui, with the intention of them spending the night at the Correr Bothy.
From the outset, weather conditions were far from ideal. The groups were already in cloud cover as they left the restaurant, with around 150 yards visibility and a wind speed of 15 to 20 knots. An hour later, and conditions had deteriorated significantly. With visibility down to just 50 yards, swirling snow and winds of up to 40 knots, it quickly became clear to the leaders of both groups that their goal of reaching the Bothy at Correr was unattainable. Both groups resorted to an alternative option, heading for the Curran emergency shelter just off the plateau. Beattie's group reached the shelter and settled in for the night, fully expecting the other group to join them at any moment. When there was still no sign of them the next morning, Beattie assumed they must have diverted to a lower shelter. He would later say, "I thought she would have dropped down to Jean's Bothy or St Valerie's."
Heavy snow overnight meant that Beattie's group had to dig themselves out of the Curran shelter, but they eventually made it back to the chairlift and then Rothimuckus, where Beattie was able to make a telephone call to Lagan. It was only upon arriving back that Beattie realised the gravity of the situation, surprised as he was that his girlfriend's party wasn't there to meet them. A massive search and rescue operation was quickly launched, involving the RAF, police, mountain rescue volunteers and even staff from nearby Glenmore Lodge.
Meanwhile, as daylight began to fade on the Sunday, Davidson and her group were in dire trouble. She had tried to go for help, accompanied by one of the stronger of her party, 15-year-old Billy Kerr, but they only made it a few yards in waist-deep snow and high winds before being forced to return. The other children, and volunteer Sheila Sunderland, were not faring any better. Davidson had spent the night constantly clearing snow from them as the group huddled together in an attempt to retain body heat. The powdery snow had made it impossible to construct a proper snow shelter, and the 3-foot-high windbreak was the best they could manage. At one point that evening, Davidson had spotted a rescuer's flare, but they hadn't spotted her, and she could not make herself heard against the wind. As darkness fell, the group was resigned to another night on the mountain.
Monday saw Davidson make an attempt to go for help alone. Billy Kerr could not accompany her this time, as he was barely able to move anymore. Davidson's orange jacket was eventually spotted by the crew of a rescue helicopter, and she was taken off the mountain with severe frostbite and in a highly confused state. Despite this, she managed to tell the crew where the rest of the group was stranded. The scene which met rescuers was appalling. The bodies of the missing were buried in the snow. All were dead, except for one. Miraculously, 15-year-old Raymond Leslie still showed signs of life. Rushed to Raigmore Hospital in Inverness, he would be the only other survivor of the disaster, along with Davidson. The group was less than a mile from the safety of the Curran shelter.
The bodies of the 6 victims were airlifted from the mountain to Braemar, where they were taken by road to a mortuary in Aberdeen for identification. The families were informed, although it had been a sleepless night anyway, after the group hadn't arrived home on the Sunday evening. Carol Bertram's father said, "We started to worry when she was not home by 10 o'clock last night. Then a policeman came about 11:20 p.m. and told us the girls were missing." He also described the 4 girls from Ainsley Park who lost their lives as inseparable. The tragedy shocked the nation and was discussed at length in Parliament. Scottish Secretary Gordon Campbell paid tribute to those who participated in the search and rescue operation. They worked tirelessly without regard for their own personal safety in very difficult conditions, and but for their efforts there would have been no survivors from the party. Indeed, at one point the RAF diverted some resources to help the staff from Glenmore Lodge, struggling to make it back through the snow after spending all night checking bothies for the missing climbers.
In the aftermath of the tragedy, serious questions clearly had to be asked. A similar fate had befallen a hiking party of 27 London school children in 1936, although the true story of what happened in their case would not emerge for many decades. At the time, the teacher who led the expedition portrayed himself as a hero who had done everything he could to save his pupils. In reality, he was a narcissist who ignored weather warnings and repeated appeals from locals to turn back. Instead, he led the children, wearing shorts and sandals, into the mountains of Germany's Black Forest. 5 of them did not survive the ordeal. The Cairngorm tragedy was clearly a very different scenario, but the wisdom of taking school children into mountainous terrain in winter was a hot topic in both the press and in Parliament. Although Beattie was an experienced climber, he was not in terms of tackling the Cairngorms in winter.
Ben Beattie would only live a few more years. During an ascent of Nanda Devi in the Himalayas in 1978, he wrote in his diary, "This has been the best day of my life." The following day, he fell 2,500 feet to his death. John Duff was a police sergeant and mountain rescue leader at the time of the Cairngorm disaster, and involved in the search. 30 years later, he gave his thoughts on events. "There was no need for the tragedy ever to have happened. To my mind, it was an expedition planned for the benefit of the instructors rather than the teenagers. It was far, far too ambitious for them."
An inquiry into the disaster did not apportion blame, but did lead to several recommendations and changes being made regarding school trips into such environments. The remote Curran emergency shelter was demolished a few years later, on the grounds that it was temptation for climbers to attempt to reach it in bad weather, rather than make a safer decision to turn around and head back down. The fact that there has been no similar tragedy since 1971 is perhaps the greatest legacy of those who died on the plateau.